or any other solutions that were somewhat awkward, we're going to manage as we are today. These kinds of events are weird. They're not funerals. We don't have a family here, although we will send to Jim's son Ben a recording of the events. I'm not sure we have a person of religious persuasion in the room, though if they are, any prayers they want to say individually are fine. I'm not sure that Jim particularly had any formal religion that he subscribed to on any regular basis. But we are a community. The 150,000 or so people wandering around this town this week are a community that Jim belonged to, benefited from, gave much to, occasionally pissed off. That's what communities usually end up being. And at least a few of us want to at least very briefly speak to that, and then we'll have the mic open for other people who might want to say something. If you are here, I don't think it's necessary to go into the detail of how peculiar Jim's childhood prodigy standard of coming into comics was. I can speak as a friend of his, a poker buddy of his for any number of years, as someone he inspired, because it was the fact that he as a 13-year-old was doing comics that made my 9-year-old self believe it was possible that someday I could. I am not, by the way, unique in that particular delusion. And I followed in many ways in his footsteps with the Legion of Superheroes, working with his characters, his children. And we competed for many years, argued for some of those years, cooperated on some nice deeds during some of those years. But I felt it was very important for someone who had given much of his life to the entertainment of the comics community to at least give everybody a chance who wanted to say something about it. In many ways, I think Jim's purest importance was to his fans. Professionals, we fight with each other. We compete with each other. We sit there and we stand in judgment of each other. He had a really good day. He didn't. I would have done this one better. At least once in the course of his life, Jim was quoted as saying, referring to me, that I would have known what to do better than him. I think it was the only one time he may have said that. But I wanted to suggest that we start with Tom, who bears a message from two of Jim's deepest fans who had the largest effect on his life. Can we, Tom, because I've got the recorder over here, can I ask everybody to come up to this mic when they speak, just so we get recorded? Yeah, I've still got 20% left. That should take us to the end of this. Fingers crossed. And you may explain yourself and your relationship to him.
Just for clarity, since with Silver Lake Edition won't have a name badge, I'm not Tom Brevoort, I'm Tom Gallagher. And yes, that gets confusing. What I'm here for is primarily, I guess, as a sort of representative of fandom and Legion fandom in particular, Legion of Superheroes, which was the book that Jim broke in on. And he actually has an interesting history with the early Legion fandom. In particular, two people, Mike Flynn and Harry Broges. And here's what they had to say about their relationship with Jim and their history with Jim. Two people most connected with early Legion fandom, Mike Flynn and Harry Broges, couldn't be here. They sent this to be read in Jim's memory. We want to talk about something we think might be underreported today: friendship. The two of us have been friends for 53 years, and our friendship's first common thread was Jim Shooter. Almost 60 years ago, when he was just 14, Jim Shooter was first published, writing our mutual favorite comic, The Legion of Superheroes. Jim's work was a revelation. not just taking us to the 30th century and other planets, but echoing our own transitions from kids to adults. But all too soon, his byline was gone. He suddenly left comics, with no explanation given in print. In the meantime, our fanzine, the Legion Outpost, anchored a growing network of Legion fans. Everyone wondered, whatever happened to Jim Shooter? After several years, Harry tracked him down, and they began a series of phone calls. As Jim explained in a phone interview with the Outpost, he left comics because he couldn't manage all of writing comics, going to college, living in New York, and helping support his family back home in Pittsburgh. A few months later, Harry and Jim met in Jim's Pittsburgh hometown. Jim couldn't have been nicer. He showed Harry and fellow Legion fans Jay Gilbert original art from his DC days, stories he had written and drawn, and a thick stack of letters from his irascible editor, Mark Meisinger. During their visit, Harry and Jay urged Jim to give comics another shot. 2 days later, they and Mike, along with Mercy Glenn Black and Rich Morrissey, visited DC editors in New York and talked about rehiring Jim to write for DC. Others also spoke up, including at least one Marvel staffer. We also begged Jim like kids in the backseat on a long trip. Don't you want to write comics again, Jim? Don't you want to write comics again, Jim? Don't you want to write comics again, Jim? Barely a month passed, and with that I don't blame him, before Jim was again writing the Legion for DC. After a little more than a year, he left the Legion again to become a Marvel assistant editor. 2 years later, he was editor-in-chief. But what Jim meant to us isn't on his resume. Over the years, Jim was a friend. He sat in our kitchens and slept on our floors. Not just ours, but others in fandom in the industry. We shared meals, and at conventions, he happily spent hours in hotel rooms packed with fans, chatting and sharing stories. He was the same person the fans who were pros, not putting on airs. He was also an inspiration. Legion fans seen his work influenced on their path to creative work include Tom and Mary Bierbaum, King Gale and Mercy in Black, Mark Waid, Casey Carlson, Michael Urey, Mike's own spouse, author Ailish Flynn, and probably many more we're forgetting. So thanks, Jim, for all the joy you brought us when comic books were just comic books, not an industry or a collectible to be bagged and graded. Thanks for inspiring the creation of Legion fandom, and for the many friendships, marriages, and careers that exist because of your talent and inspiration. We hope that your voyage to Shambhala, the 30th century memorial planetoid for heroes, has been full of wonderful stories shared with all the wonderful people you have known. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Todd. The two things that Jim had the largest impact on in comics were his run on Legion of Superheroes, which Tom just spoke of, and his roughly 9-year tenure as editor-in-chief at Marvel, a job which had been, to put it gently, a rotating torture session for a number of people immediately preceding him who each ran either in fear, disgust, or exhaustion. But the impact he had on Marvel lasted way beyond the years he was in charge. Representing Marvel, we have two of their most senior people. I'm not sure which order you guys would like to speak in. Toss it up. All right. From one Tom to another. Tom Brevoort. Are you at this point the senior surviving member of the Marvel editorial staff?
I'm the oldest one left.
And yet you're alive. Bless you, sir. Go for it. Super villains can't kill editors.
See, I wasn't as smart as the other Tom to get somebody to write something that I could say here. So I'm going to bumble around a little bit here, especially because I only had very sparse dealings with Jim for the whole of my 36 years at Marvel. I started at Marvel in 1989. By that point, he was no longer there. He was off starting up what would become Voyager and Valiant. But very much the Marvel that I walked into in 1989 was a Marvel that was influenced and really built by Jim. When Jim came in as not even editor-in-chief, but editor, because at that point at Marvel there was only one editor. he very quickly saw that that system was insane and couldn't work anymore, a holdover of the days when Marvel published a dozen titles or fewer and Stan Lee could oversee everything. And he prevailed upon the powers that be at that time to build what is still the editorial structure that we have in place today, which is to say an editor-in-chief who oversees the activities of more junior editors and assistant editors, each of whom have ownership or custodianship of a smaller number of titles. And in that way, a little bit more attention and care can be paid to each book than was at all possible for the editors that preceded Jim, who had to try to somehow wrangle 50 or 60 titles every month. It was an unworkable thing, and Jim basically, by using the experience he'd gotten working for DC for more in the 60s, pretty much just took that whole system and went, this is kind of what we need over here. Marvel in the 70s was at best chaos. And it could be a good kind of chaos. Some very fine things came out of that chaos. But it could also be messy. Everybody who was around during those days remembers the blight that was picking up some new comic with a new cover and cracking it open when you got home and finding that it was a reprint from a few years earlier because the creative team somehow didn't get that month's comic finished. In addition, some of the work just wasn't very good, to put it bluntly. And so while Jim sort of brought a structure to what we do, he was also very invested as a teacher of the basic craft of making comics and the lessons that he had learned as a young guy growing up under Mort and under others. And he made it his business to mentor younger creators and editors who were there, and to provide opportunities and pass on that accumulated knowledge to other people. Sometimes he would pass it on a little too strongly, let us say. He definitely had very specific ideas of what he thought made for a good comic, a good story, a good page, and so forth. But the plain fact of the matter is, while you could look at the Marvel of his era, and certainly there are a whole bunch of highlights, runs that people still talk about now, whether it's X-Men by Chris, or John Byrne's Fantastic Four, or Walter's Thor, or what have you, Frank's Daredevil. The real sort of evidence is the bottom, the worst books, the crummiest books were a lot better than the crummiest books before he came in. He elevated the whole of the line, pretty much through tutelage and just sheer will. And that lasts kind of to this day. The editorial structure, as I said at the top of this, that we still exist in is virtually the same as the one that he put into place. Beyond that, a towering figure both physically and as a player in the industry. He created a lot of good work for a lot of different companies. He was super resilient in that a couple of times in his career he got knocked down and sort of dusted himself off and found a way to begin again and try another thing and move forward, which I think is admirable. And he had a super unique perspective on the industry. So I appreciate him as a figure. And like I said, I never really I came close once or twice, never ever actually worked with him. So I don't have any really great, here is my Jim Shooter story. All of mine are about reading comics that he did. So.
So much like Tom, I didn't prepare anything either. While I knew Jim, I didn't really know Jim, so I just wanted to tell a series of different stories and anecdotes from over the course of my career that intersected with Jim's life, directly and indirectly. you know, as Paul said, you know, Jim started in this industry, in the comic book industry when he was 13. And that age was very important to me because the first time I met Jim, first time I went to a comic book convention was when I was 13 years old, in 1984. It was, I think it was one of the Greenberg shows at the Pennsylvania Hotel across from Madison Square Garden, for those who've been in New York might know about. And I just started getting into following creators, not just comic book characters, but creators. You know, there were these people that made these comic books, and I liked their stories, and I liked their art, and I wanted to follow those men and women who were making comics. And there was a row of Marvel talent at that point, or comic talent from the New York area, and I remember specifically because I still have a piece of paper with their signatures on it. I didn't bring anything. I didn't know what you were supposed to do with these conventions. I think it was Bob Layton, Jim Starlin, David Cowan, George Perez was there, and also Jim Shooter. But I wasn't as familiar with Jim Shooter as I was with some of the other gentlemen who I was there meeting and speaking with. And Jim was quick to correct me as a young, and educate me as a young fan as to some of his work, which I was able to eventually go out and pick up. And as the years went by, and I got to know you know, Jim through the credits and the comics, and like Tom just said, you know, the comics that really made me the reader and the fan that I was, by Frank, and by Walter, by John, by Bill Sienkiewicz. You know, his name was in the masthead on all those books, and the impact he had on bringing those artists into Marvel and opening my eyes up to different creative styles. I think was a direct influence on me, not being just where I am as the editor-in-chief today of Marvel Comics, but when I was the talent scout. I would go around the world and I would just have to tell people that Marvel never had a house style, because there was that misconception that all artists have to draw the same, you have to draw a Marvel style. And yes, there was a book, How to Draw the Marvel Style, or How to Draw the Marvel Way, but there was never really a style. That was a guide to learn from, you know, from John back in the day, John. But it was so many different styles, you know, from early on from what Kirby and Steve Ditko did, you know, to those artists who vastly changed the Marvel landscape in the 80s. And then later on, my first job in comics was at a comic book store. And this was a time when Jim had left Marvel and was starting Valiant. And I just remember the Valiant boom and everything behind it. I was in the store when fans would come in and were clamoring for those issues, trying to get Rye number 3. It was such a big deal, and everyone said Jim had done it again. Wow, he became left editor-in-chief of one of the bigger companies that came in. He created the rival to Marvel. These guys are going to take down Marvel and DC. And those were just another more memories of Jim, how he was constantly in my life in different ways. Then my next big place where Jim influenced me was when I started at Marvel. And I started at Marvel as an associate editor under Ralph Macchio. I don't know if people know Ralph Macchio, but he was, you know, him, Mark Grunwald, some of the classic long-term editors at Marvel. Ralph and Jim did not have the best relationship, let's say. And Ralph loved to tell stories about Jim, but not in the most positive of lights. But through those stories, and listening to those stories, and then talking to other people like Tom DeFalco, or some of those artists who would come up to the office, I heard both sides, and it's kind of what Tom said. What a good teacher Jim was, how he really educated people about, in his opinion, about how comics would be, but did end up with the best intentions, making them better, even if he did it with kind of a strong fist at many points, in many ways. And if people are ever interested, I don't know if Ralph will ever share this, he shared it with us. Ralph has what he called the shooter files. Back then, memos were passed internally. There was no internet. There was an internal mail system. So when the mail card would come around, you know, Jim would type up memos or something he liked or didn't like, make copies, put it on the thing, and they would go around. Every morning, people would find the rules from Jim Shooter on their desk, and all kinds of great memos. I remember one that he had where Jim actually tried to show people, here's how I would draw shoelaces. And expected to draw everyone to draw shoelaces in those ways. But if everyone wants a great look into Jim and some of the things that he brought to Marvel artistically and editorially, there's a lot of great information out there. Jim had a copy of it that he would take to shows in the later years of his life to show people too, to go through a lot of it. I remember looking through it on his desk or on his table at a couple of conventions. And then you know, recently, you know, we heard the news of Jim's passing, and in getting together a memorial page that we'll run in all the Marvel comics in the next few weeks, we had the idea that we want to talk to all the old editor-in-chiefs, and we want to have everybody who had the job after Jim possibly say something about it. And you'll be able to read those soon when the book comes out, and online we're going to be putting up a lot more memories from different people from around the industry who worked with Jim, who respected Jim, who just knew Jim as a fan or as of his writing, or as an editor, or came into contact with him, over the years. And it was wonderful to get the different takes that people had from Roy Thomas, through Joe Quesada, Axel Alonso, Bob Harris, the gentleman who preceded me in this position. And they had more personal relationships with Jim, and hearing their stories I think would be very interesting for everyone. The last time I met Jim personally, I remember, actually, just if I can digress for 1 second. The first time I met Jim, when he was he was sitting down, so I never realized how tall he was, but I never seen pictures of him in the old Marvel Age magazines. You remember those, back in the day. And I remember it was in the late 90s. It was in the early 2000s. Joe Quesada was trying to get the previous editor-in-chiefs all together for a gathering, and a lot of them had come. We were at a bar, Pool Lake Saloon, and Bob Harris was there, and Tom DeFalco, and no one knew if Jim would show up. And I remember there was the rumor, Jim's outside. I'm like, oh my God, Jim's here. And I remember he just had to duck to get in the door. And that's what I remember. Oh my God, he really is that big in person, you forget. But the last time I saw Jim was at Terrificon in Connecticut 2 years ago. And I never got to meet him or interact with him since I'd taken over the position. So I waited in line, and when he went up, I introduced myself again. And I said, Jim, it's an honor. I wouldn't be here. I'm the new editor. Well, I wasn't new. I was the current editor-in-chief of Marvel. I learned so much from you and from everything you did before you. And I take a lot of the things that you did and try to apply them to the way that I work at Marvel and how we treat the team. And I said, just any last bits of advice or anything that you may have overlooked. And he just looked at me very deadpan and went, better you than me. But we shook hands, we took a picture, and it's the whole said, hey, see you around kind of thing. And then it's been passing at a few other shows, and I heard of his passing, and affected me pretty deeply, because I really wouldn't be here today in many different ways doing what I'm doing without the influence of Jim Shooter on what he did for not just Marvel Comics, but comics in general, and the editorial direction that he sent this industry in. So just wanted to share a few words and thank Jim for everything he did for us as comic book fans.
We have a little time. If there are people who would like to say something.
Paul, can I actually say something personal?
Sure, yes. Jim wasn't fond of reprints, so we're trusting you bringing original material to the second round.
Okay, this is going to be a fill-in issue. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about his work and how he taught me the meaning of frustration at an early age. Not deliberately, personally. The first Legion of Superheroes comic I read was Adventure number 359. How many people remember that one? It's by the issue number? Okay. This is a story that I read when I was about 4 years old. I need to tell you how I read comic books at that time. We moved from a small town in western North Carolina to Charlotte, but every month we'd go back and visit relatives. Now, back then there were things called newsstands that had comics and magazines, and in this case, there were also candy stores. One of them had a popcorn machine. And there were two of them in this little small two-block business district hometown of mine. And of course, because of candy and popcorn, I'd get a free one every time we went there. My father or grandparents would take me there. And being a compulsive reader, I started noticing, hey, we need stuff. Let's check this out. And that's how I started buying comic books there. But we didn't have a place to go in Charlotte to buy them yet. So pick up Adventure 359, immediately fall in love with Legion of Superheroes. Brainiac 5 is still my favorite character, and kudos to Paul, who put me into a Legion story as the creator of Galloway's theorem, which Brainiac 5 actually respects. Yes. Thank you again, Paul. But in this story, the Legion is out. They come back from the mission, Half of them by the end of the issue are imprisoned in a slave labor camp on a different planet. Half of them are hiding in the metropolis sewer system. Their families have turned against them. The entire population of Earth has turned against them. How are they going to get out of this? Remember I said that we went up there about every month? It wasn't exactly every month. So, as I put together later, we went up there the last week 359 was on sale. We didn't go back for 5 weeks. This meant that part 2 had gone off sale and number 361 was on sale. This confused the heck out of 4-year-old me at the time. It took me 16 years to read part 2 of that story and find out how they got out of everything. Thus, learning the meaning of frustration. But it was a great story. The other one I just want to mention, because I don't think this one really gets enough credit these days or enough attention. When I was back at Marvel, I believe this is before he was editor-in-chief, or maybe when he was becoming editor-in-chief. He was writing the Avengers, starting with George Perez, at least for this particular story. This is a story called the Korvac saga. I went back and reread this the other day, and it's not great literature. I mean, I could show it to my sister. She has a doctorate in freaking literature, and she would go, "Oh no, this is not great literature." But it is a great comic book story, because it starts off with something happening, and things are happening in the background. Avengers are sort of disappearing offhand, popping out. No one has any idea what's going on. They're dealing with some other menaces, but there's this whole thing floating in the background, getting more and more intense. There are lots of nice little side character bits. There are lots of situational humor happening in bits. And it eventually leads up, and this is about a 10-issue saga. There's unfortunately some failing scripters. Perez left after about 4 issues, and I'm not sure they had a consistent artist at that point. But by the end, he's managed to bring back just about everyone who's ever been an Avenger. So we're talking not Secret Wars, you can see this by years, but a giant mass onslaught of every Avenger ever is back. And they invade a house in, I think it was Forest Hills, one of the New York suburban areas. And they encounter a Korvac who's sort of half man, half machine, but had managed to get on Galactus' world ship, hook himself up to the computer network, and became a god. And they start fighting. Korvac, or as he's calling himself at this point, Michael, is killing every single Avenger. There's nice little solo fights. Captain America holds up against him for about 30 seconds. Wonder Man overcomes fear. Thor is going after him, as well as some groups. But by the end of this, Thor is the only one who's partially standing. I won't spoil how he does end up sort of half suiciding, half being defeated. But at the end, he does bring the Avengers back from death to, okay, they're almost dead. Don Blake better get to work on these guys. But I wrote this just before I went to college, and it was just a really great story. And I think this ties in with the whole thing about teaching people how to write comics, how to do commercial comics, how to write a good, solid story. And I think I'm not sure if it's in print at the moment. Do you guys know? Okay. I recommend it. I recommend it if it's not out there. Outlaw Legions, of course, available in various reprints and the like. But these are just 2 stories of gems that I really liked.
And of course, we know that in good comic book tradition, no one is always dead. So that's, whether Jim comes back or we just bring him back by reading the stories, that's as close as we can get. We had a person or 2 here, 1 or 2.
Just come on out to
Yeah, you know what? Yeah. This is a Jim Shooter Memorial. Ladies first. Jim liked the ladies.
So a little backstory that's Jim's gonna play into later. So I work a lot of Comic Cons, and my favorite industry to work at shows is actually the comic book industry. And so, as you guys can see, I'm dressed as Matt Murdock. So at my very first Comic Con, ever, honestly at this point I had not read a single comic at all. I was there because the Daredevil cast was there from the Netflix show. And Jim Shooter was hosting a panel about, about his time as editor-in-chief, and he was talking, a lot about Daredevil, and just as I, sat there and was listening to him, I could just see, how much he truly actually cared about all of these stories. And like, it was during this panel, when I was listening to Jim, that I just, fell in love with the comic book industry. And I started, reading stuff like crazy. And then, soon after that, basically he inspired me to start working shows, and I've, just met so many wonderful people who have worked for Jim in different capacities. And, it's been cool to hear how much of them, have been just touched by his, his work, his life, what he's done. He actually tried to sign a Daredevil comic book for me, but it was with a really dead Sharpie. You couldn't really tell, and unfortunately Charlie Cox signed over it, so you really can't tell that it was ever there. But that's just like a cool little memory. I know that the signature was there, and I know that, that conversation that I had with Jim way back then, I have memory of that, and now, past, present, and future, I get to work with some incredible comic book guests, and I just, and it's all inspired by Jim Shooter.
Hello. So I'm Mark Ditko, and I'm coming at this from an angle of my uncle, Steve Ditko. And I grew up in comics, around comics, and kind of got out when I had my family and in Phoenix. But when I came to Los Angeles, moved to Los Angeles, I got back into comics, started reading again, and started going to comic conventions. And so in the early 90s, I name dropped and eventually, got introduced to Jim Shooter. And so that was my first time that I had met him. But what was very apparent is how much he loved the industry. And particularly, I have to say, he loved my uncle, Steve Ditko. And we just sort of commiserated for a while on he had left a book, Dark Dominion, at Defiant. So we really kind of connected there, that we were so disappointed that we thought that book was just so perfect for him. So I had seen him periodically through different conventions, but and my last encounter with him was a couple of years ago in New York at a tribute panel for Jack Kirby, and he and I just started talking, and he ended up probably turning a third of that panel into about Steve Ditko. So clearly, he had so much connection with my uncle. He did, from my understanding and from my observation when he was at Marvel, he wanted to have a place for Steve Ditko. He wanted him to, he said, let's find something for these guys. And then when he left and he went to Valiant, he hunted down my uncle and had my uncle do stuff at Valiant. And he left, and I think it was Broadway, and he hunted down my uncle. And he went to create a Defiant and hunted down my uncle. And so there was, he cared not only was he good at what he did, but he cared about the history. He cared about those people. He cared about, the origins of this industry. And he really felt, maybe not obligated, maybe that's a strong word, but he felt that they had something to continually offer, and he wanted to give them a platform. So for me, it was just that my interactions with him, it was clear that he loved the industry, he loved the history, and he was doing everything in his power to expand it. Yeah, so I'm going to miss him.
Hi. So I met Jim Shooter I am reading Marvel Comics in kind of a unique way. I started in 1939 with Marvel Mystery Comics 1, and I'm reading every single Marvel comic published up until 2007. So when I met Jim Shooter, I was in 1983 or 84. So I was kind of like at the height of his editorial reign. And it was my first convention, so I was feeling a lot of like imposter syndrome. And that was probably the convention where I got the most people asking me, are you shopping for a boyfriend? Are you shopping for a brother? Are you looking for a gift? But then I talked to Jim Shooter, and he was the first person in comics who made me feel like I belonged. He signed the whole Korvac saga for me for free, because it was my favorite book at the time, and he let me interview him for a full 4 days. So I think he will be very, very missed.
Did you ever publish the interview?
No, I do still have it, but yeah.
It's history. Jogging up to the front.
The last time I came to Comic-Con was either 1993 or 1994. I was 13. Jim Shooter was kind to me. He let me hang out at 1 year the Valiant booth, the next year the Defiant booth. He saw that I had no idea how to write comics, how to be in the industry of comics, or what to do in comics, but that I loved it. He invited me to the Defiant office to show me how comics were made and all the jobs that exist beyond the penciler, the inker, the colorist. And I think when he is considered as someone industrializing comics or making rules for how comics could be, it misses that he saw the teamwork and the potential for everyone to participate in comics as a reader and as a creator. And clearly that influence is still felt, and I hope everyone here feels that, and that whoever is 13 today will show us what they can make for the next 30 years.
Maybe one more after this, and then we're going to shoot us out of the room.
I only met Jim Shooter once, and we didn't spend a lot of time together, but it was at my second Comic-Con, which would have been 1985, close to when the Fantastic Four had just turned 25, and I had a poster that was pre-printed with Jim Shooter's name and Stan Lee's name, and I run into Jim Shooter in the elevator, and he sees it, and he says, let me sign it, and he said, hey, Stan's here, you know, over at panel, so why don't you just go? And that was a different time at Comic-Con. As soon as the panel ended, I jumped right up to go get him. He signed it, and that was it. But I had my personal only time with Jim Shooter, and I enjoyed it, and wish him well.
So as just a comic book fan and a comic book reader, I'm not involved in the industry at all, but I love coming to these shows and talking to the creators. I ran into Jim Shooter at New York Comic Con about 2 years ago. And he's signing some books for me. He asked me what I'm doing, and I'm a high school math teacher, and he said, well, what do you teach? And I say, well, I currently teach AP Calculus. And he looked at me and kind of did this with his glasses and said, oh, so you actually teach something somewhat sophisticated. I guess, but I guess I earned his respect because I'm flipping through his binders of old articles and photos and whatnot, and I'm such a nut for comic book history, and he could tell that I was into it. And he was so honest and welcoming to me. Had about a 30-minute conversation with me, talking to me about Gene Colan and Frank Miller, and yes, Steve Ditko, and several others, and gave me all of the ins and outs on who the Weasley lawyers upstairs at Marvel, and who was telling the truth in this article and who wasn't, and that kind of thing, and just his openness and honesty. What other industry can we all think of in entertainment where you have this kind of access to the people who made it happen and be able to talk to them and really feel like a participant in all of it? And I felt so included and like I was part of the club, right? Like the Mary Marvel Marching Society, like I was part of it. And that's because of Jim Shooter's generosity and his time and his willingness to sit down and speak with each of us. So I will definitely miss that.
Sorry.
Hello, I'm Josh. So I wanted to acknowledge two things that Jim did for the comic book industry. The first thing is that in the late 70s, he helped create the direct market versus the newsstand, which is a big deal now because that you can only buy comics in comic stores. And he helped lead the charge for that, which was a big deal, because comics were only sold in newsstands and they would get torn apart, thrown away at the end of their time on a newsstand. And so if you collect comics, you can now get comics at comic stores from the direct market because of him. He was, at Marvel, when he was there, led the charge to do that. And of course, the whole industry runs now from comic shops. You can't find them on newsstands anymore. So that's a huge thing that doesn't always get attributed to him for many of his things. And then the other thing is, I'm wearing a G.I. Joe shirt, and he's always, got credit for all the work that he did with comics and superheroes and all, but he helped Hasbro turn G.I. Joe comic books and turn that whole, if you ever collect G.I. Joe toys, you can thank him because he brought G.I. Joe to Marvel Comics from Hasbro and then hired Larry Hama. So it's beyond superheroes and just being an editor that he had an impact. So that's all I wanted to acknowledge in a very different way than I've heard tonight. Thank you.
I'm going to close with an observation that is not specific to Jim, but is specific to you and the people we've listened to. One of the wonderful things about the comic book business is moments like this convention. Occasionally you can meet an actor from a movie. Occasionally you can meet the writer or director of a movie. Directors are hard. They're usually cowering in fear. It took a lot of work to talk Chris Nolan onto his first convention podium to kind of hold his hand all the way up. Because they're afraid of what you might say. And just their industries like that. Prose book authors show up for book signings occasionally. It's usually just when a book comes out, and then they go back to work on their next book. And it's, they hit 10 stores. An awful lot of comic book creators are here. An awful lot of comic book creators are at every convention you meet. It is what in my tribe we would describe as a mitzvah, a good deed, to tell people when you love their work while they're alive. Comics have provided many creative people with good livings, a lot of people with not quite as good livings. It's not easy work to do. Not everyone's great at it. But if you're publishing comics, you're probably working damn hard to do it. So please, take the time, whoever's stuff you like. Doesn't matter who they are. Your favorites are your favorites. You love the Jim Shooter's work? I did as a kid, and that was always part of my feeling about Jim, even when we differed on how things might happen in the field, or differed in the facts of who had done what for the direct market or other things. Say that to people. Share your love as fans, and that helps us all function. Thank you for being here for him. I will send this to his son with an acknowledgement that I think we have about 150 people here, which is pretty fucking good. There's 400 other things going on in this convention that are more positive than saying farewell to someone who died, and never mind what else is going on in the rest of San Diego. It's a nice honor. Go home and read a good comic book. One of Jim's, one of ours, one of a stranger's, and come back tomorrow and thank the person who did it. Have a good evening. Thank you for being here.